Breaking news, former Trump attorney and New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani has been officially disbarred in New York for lying about the 2020 election. A panel of judges wrote that Giuliani, quote, communicated demonstrably false and misleading statements to courts, lawmakers, and the public at large regarding the 2020 election. Now, the panel went on to say that Giuliani flagrantly misused his position as Trump's lawyer and deliberately violated some of the most fundamental tenets of the legal profession. Giuliani was suspended from practicing law in New York in 2021. Back in May, Giuliani was indicted in Arizona for his role in overturning the 2020 election, allegedly. Giuliani's son, Andrew Giuliani, stood by his dad, tweeting, quote, Rudy Giuliani, the most important change agent in the history of New York City, has been disbarred. Joe Biden and his leftist flunkies are simply tyrannical. They will stop at nothing to hold on to power. Your freedom is at stake on November 5th.
And in other Trump world news, former Trump advisor Steve Bannon surrendered to law enforcement to begin his 4-month prison sentence for contempt of Congress. As a reminder, Bannon was found guilty for refusing to honor a subpoena from a committee investigating January 6th. But Bannon has assured supporters that he's, quote, going to be more powerful in prison than I am now.
Let's start with Giuliani. Obviously, he was already his law license had been suspended. Now this is the formal procedure to say that he's disbarred and can't practice law, stemming from his series of outrageous, flagrant conduct that has gotten himself in trouble and has gotten Donald Trump in trouble. Trump must be thinking this was the worst effing attorney of all time because so much of Trump's own peril comes from listening to Giuliani at key moments. Going back to the initial impeachment that Trump faced while in office over the pressuring of the Ukraine judge, that was substantially motivated by Giuliani convincing him that he could use this moment to get something favorable for the campaign. That was terrible advice that he listened to from Giuliani, and then the advice only got worse in the January 6th period, where Giuliani promised and discussed and went on TV and talked about these vast amounts of fraud relating to tangible physical misplacement of ballots. He got himself sued by an election worker over that. And so now it's come to this really an interesting turn of events for a political figure who was once like the most beloved person in the country.
Yeah, and certainly one of the more capable federal prosecutors in the country. I mean, this at least leaves him some time to spend more time with his growing list of indictments. The fact is, if you want to talk about mental decline, people talk about Joe Biden. Look at Rudy Giuliani. I'm not sure that he can even help himself anymore. I mean, right after being found guilty of defaming election workers in Georgia, he walked out of the courtroom and then defamed them again and ended up being sued again, and he will lose again. This guy has been an atomic bomb for Republican circles. Almost everything that he has done has either led to himself being indicted, people who work with him being indicted, or the former president being indicted. It's hard to believe that anyone gave him this much power, but it shows you that in this Trumpified Republican Party, close allies of the big guy, they get their way. You don't question them, even if what they're saying is objectively insane. And then you end up in situations like this.
I always try to remind MAGA people that Giuliani's commitment to the MAGA agenda was totally skin deep when he ran for president in 2008. Giuliani did. He ran as a crusading neocon, the most hawkish person of all. He attacked Ron Paul for being soft on terrorism. Ron Paul, whose foreign policy has now formed the basis of the MAGA movement. Giuliani was full-throated defender of everything Trump and Trump people say they're against in the Republican Party. I think one of the most obvious ways in which Trump has not succeeded in getting his policies accomplished is listening to people that he just thought were good on television in the foreign policy category. That was true of Ambassador John Bolton, who is now totally against Trump and whose foreign policy was contrary to Trump. But Trump said, I like how he argues on TV. I'm putting him in my administration. And that has happened time and time again. So not surprising to see it come to this fate with Giuliani. Interesting nonetheless. Let's move on to Steve Bannon. So my attitude on Bannon is that, and okay, he's defied a subpoena, so this is a pretty standard thing to happen. He said this will make him more powerful. He might be right, Bannon sees himself, I was just reading this interview that the New York Times, that David Brooks did with Steve Bannon, and Brooks asked him, do you see yourself in the same business as Fox News, as Roger Ailes' right-wing journalism? And Bannon responds, no. I'm not a journalist. I'm not in the media. This is a military headquarters for a populist revolt. This is how we motivate people. This show is an activist show, the show that Steve Bannon does. Mm-hmm. If you watch the show, you're a foot soldier. We call it the Army of the Awakened. He goes on to say that Rupert Murdoch is a bigger threat to what he's doing than MSNBC because it's, like controlled opposition and that kind of thing. Bannon sees himself as a warrior on behalf of populism. He's an activist. I could very well see how imprisoning him makes him more popular or sympathetic to the kinds of, he's trying to rope more Republicans into his view of the way the world ought to work.
Yeah, and it's certainly a terrifying thing for democracy because you look at Steve Bannon, Michael Flynn, Nick Fuentes, all of these people who orbit this extreme MAGA circle. They believe and will openly tell you that they think democracy has run its course, that it doesn't work, that it's time for an alternative. And that alternative is authoritarianism under Donald Trump. I mean, Steve Bannon will certainly have a lot of friends in prison. A lot of the people that he enabled and empowered and motivated on January 6th are also going to be in prison with him. The fact is, Steve Bannon is not some outlier to the Republican Party. He is increasingly what the Republican Party believes. And they will unapologetically tell you that if you ask them. For him, this prison is a badge of honor. He's going to come out, he's going to make hay of it, and he's going to go back to selling male enhancement supplements and touting autocracy on a web show.
Well, I would say the aspects of Bannonism or populism or whatever has occurred on the right that speak to the concerns of ordinary Americans about immigration, about the mismanagement of our economy by the elites, about frankly, a certain lack of democracy in how fundamental policies are made, going back to COVID, where none of this, or very little of it, seemed freely chosen by the people. It was all ruled by mandates and fiats and central authority. So I hear you on the democracy is at stake, and as I've said, I'm not a big fan of many of Trump's policies, or certainly him as a political actor. But the aspect of this that is about dismantling an elite consensus or a central authority that so many Americans think has mismanaged this country and is not fundamentally democratic. And then on the other side, they're putting up someone who faced no democratic pressure to have there be a different candidate, who's being shielded from the forces of democracy at every turn, and who himself or his administration or his simpaticos have tried to keep Trump off the ballot and imprison him. I don't know. I think the democracy argument starts to get a little dicey. Who's for democracy here?
Well, I think it's easy to say Steve Bannon is not. I mean,
Steve Bannon's not, sure.
You look at the message that he and others in his group are sending. They want the authority to overturn elections in which Republicans lose. They want a unitary executive with unlimited amounts of power to enforce law above and beyond Congress, which they've now received from the Supreme Court. And they want a system that's outlined very well in Project 2025, where there is a presidency in scope and power unlike any we've seen before, that does not represent the needs of the people, but represents the needs of what the far right thinks the people need. And that is textbook authoritarianism. There's no way around that. And Bannon is the first one to say that.
How is it authoritarianism to start getting rid of federal employees that don't face democratic accountability because they are not in step with what a new administration wants them to do? I mean, that is Project 2025 at its core. I'm sure there are other aspects of it that I don't like and don't agree with, but fundamentally it's the idea that even when Republicans win office, when Donald Trump wins legitimately, as he did in 2016, the conservatives and Republicans who win a mandate, win the presidency, win sometimes majorities in Congress, are not able to implement what they were tasked with doing because the federal bureaucracy is itself progressive ideologically at its core and cannot be replaced enough. We don't have a spoils system anymore. We have an entrenched bureaucracy that continues operating, and there's a lot of business as usual regardless of who's in control. So my understanding of Project 2025 is that this is an effort to grapple with that reality, that there is that the Trump agenda, not overturning elections or not whatever else, but the Trump agenda on immigration and on the economy and maybe on foreign policy or maybe on other issues does not get implemented because the people who face no democratic accountability are hostile to it, and Project 2025 is an attempt to remedy that.
Well, it's also a much more expansive document. I encourage you to take a look. I mean, including things like invoking the Riot Act and calling the military out against protesters, jailing peaceful protesters. And you're talking about not just turning over parts of the bureaucracy. That happens in every presidential administration. What Project 2025 is very clearly laying out is overturning the civil service, is removing everyone who does not pass a loyalty test to Donald Trump, and effectively taking us back to a period where we had a spoils system that didn't depend on your competence, on your expertise to do the job. There was no interest in making government function. It was a pure loyalty operation. That's what Donald Trump has always been clear that he wants. And for everyone else, as Steve Bannon and Trump said at the debate, it's going to be vengeance.
No. I mean, you mentioned, like, for instance, deploying the military against rioters. Do I personally think that's a good idea? No. But a majority of American people supported doing just that. So again, when there's support for the policies of Republican political figures, when it's popular to do what Republicans want to get in office to do, they still can't do it because of the way the state is set up now. And you can think that's not a problem. It just doesn't seem very democratic to me, I guess, to have the Republicans never able to do what they want because the state is set up against them, even when it is popular.
We argue that the Republicans aren't able to do what we want. We've just seen a Supreme Court essentially grant the presidency near unlimited
Well,
deference.
in order to protect himself personally, which I don't agree with. I think
we've
that is
seen a Republican supermajority in the court and a Republican majority across the federal bench enforcing huge chunks of Donald Trump's legislation and then hindering Joe Biden's, in some cases, where it's nearly identical. I mean, to say that Republicans aren't able to achieve anything they want is to overlook this massive 50-year effort that has been very successful in reshaping the court.
That is the thing they have going for them right now.
That's quite a thing.
More Rising right after this.